The mercury hit 18 below zero on the morning Tom Brennan found his livestock dead. January 1943, and the wind coming off the Kansas plains carried the kind of cold that turned spit to ice before it hit the ground. Tom stumbled into his barn at first light, expecting to hear the familiar sounds of his dairy herd stirring for morning feed. Instead, he found silence broken only by the creak of frozen wood and the horrible sight of 12 Holstein cows lying stiff in their stalls. They hadn't frozen to death, though the cold was brutal enough for that. They died of thirst. Every single water line in Tom's barn had frozen solid 3 days earlier, and in his desperate attempt to fix the problem, he'd made a fatal mistake that cost him his entire herd and nearly destroyed his family's 100-year-old farm. Tom's tragedy wasn't unique. Across the American Midwest during the brutal winters of the 1930s and 40s, thousands of farmers learned a counterintuitive lesson that would be passed down through generations. Sometimes you have to waste water to save everything else. The practice of letting faucets drip during freezing weather seems wasteful, almost criminal to folks who'd survived the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. But this simple act, this tiny trickle of moving water, stood between survival and catastrophe for countless farming families. Understanding why requires going back to a time when rural America was transforming from a world of hand-pumped wells and outdoor privies to one with indoor plumbing and pressurized water systems. It's a story about physics, economics, and the hard-won wisdom of communities that learn to read the weather like a matter of life and death. Before the 1930s, most American farms didn't have the problem of frozen pipes because they didn't have pipes at all. Water came from wells, springs, and hand pumps. You carried it in buckets, heated it on wood stoves, and you never took a drop for granted. Livestock drank from troughs you filled by hand, breaking ice with whatever tool you had handy on winter mornings. But the 1930s brought massive changes to rural America. The Rural Electrification Administration, established in 1935, started bringing electric power to farms that had operated by kerosene lamp and human muscle since the frontier days. With electricity came electric pumps. With electric pumps came the possibility of pressurized water systems. And with pressurized systems came metal pipes running through unheated barns, milk houses, and the outer walls of farmhouses. Sarah Mitchell, who ran a dairy operation outside Madison, Wisconsin, was among the first in her county to install a complete pressurized water system in 1937. She'd inherited the farm from her father, who'd worked it since the turn of the century, with nothing but a hand pump and determination. Sarah saw the new system as progress, a way to reduce the brutal physical labor of dairy farming, and maybe, just maybe, keep her 3 sons from abandoning farm life for factory work in Milwaukee. The plumber from town charged her $97 to run galvanized steel pipes from her new electric pump through the milk house and into the dairy barn. It was a fortune, nearly 2 months' income from her milk sales, but Sarah convinced herself it was an investment. She could water her 40-head dairy herd with the turn of a valve instead of carrying buckets through the snow. She could wash milk cans without heating water on the stove. She could maybe even install a bathroom inside the house instead of making that frozen march to the outhouse every winter morning. The system worked beautifully through the fall of 1937. Then December arrived with temperatures that made old-timers shake their heads and recall winters from their childhood. On December 23rd, the thermometer outside Sarah's kitchen window read 9 below zero. On Christmas Eve, it dropped to 15 below. By the morning of December 26th, it had plummeted to 23 below, and Sarah woke to a silence that filled her with dread. She turned the faucet in her kitchen. Nothing. She tried the valve in the milk house. Still nothing. She ran to the barn, her breath forming ice crystals in the air, and attempted to fill the watering trough. The pipes were frozen solid, and somewhere in that network of galvanized steel, water had turned to ice, expanding with a force that would soon reveal itself in catastrophic fashion. Water is one of the few substances on Earth that expands when it freezes. Most materials contract as they cool, so their molecules moving slower and packing tighter together. But water molecules form a crystalline structure as they freeze, a hexagonal lattice with more space between molecules than liquid water has. This means ice takes up about 9% more volume than the water it came from. 9% doesn't sound like much until you understand what it means inside a sealed metal pipe. A 1-inch galvanized steel pipe filled with water creates tremendous pressure when that water freezes. The ice doesn't compress, it can't shrink. It has nowhere to go except outward, pushing against the pipe walls with a force that can exceed 25,000 pounds per square inch. For comparison, that's roughly 16 times the pressure in a car tire and enough to rupture even thick-walled steel. Sarah didn't know the exact physics, but she understood the result when she heard the first crack. It sounded like a rifle shot echoing through the milk house, then another, and another. As the temperature climbed above freezing later that day, the ice in her pipes began to thaw, and the water came pouring out of a dozen splits and ruptures in her brand-new plumbing system. The repair bill was $134, more than the original installation had cost, more than Sarah could afford after a depression-weakened market had already cut her milk prices to near nothing. She had to borrow money from her brother in town, money she resented needing, and money that came with unspoken judgments about whether a woman could really run a dairy farm alone. But Sarah learned something that winter that she'd pass on to every farmer who'd listen. Her neighbor, Old Man Henderson, whose farm had weathered 50 Wisconsin winters, came by to help with the repairs. He looked at Sarah's damaged pipes and shook his head. "I've got to keep the water moving," he said, his voice rough from a lifetime of calling to cattle across frozen fields. "Even just a drip. Moving water don't freeze the same as still water." It sounded crazy to Sarah. Letting water run all night, every night when it got cold enough, that was waste. That was the kind of carelessness that would have gotten you lectured by your parents during the Dust Bowl years, when every drop mattered. But Henderson explained it in terms that made sense to anyone who'd watched a creek in winter. "You ever notice," he said, "how a creek keeps flowing even when the pond's frozen solid? Fast water in the middle of a river, that stays liquid even when the edges ice up. It's not about the speed, really. It's about movement. Moving water transfers heat different, gives the cold less time to work." Henderson was right, though his explanation was more practical wisdom than precise science. Moving water does resist freezing better than still water, but not quite for the reasons most farmers thought. The key is heat transfer. Water in a pipe loses heat to the surrounding air through the pipe walls. If the water is still, that heat loss creates a gradient, the water near the pipe walls cooling faster than water in the center. Once ice begins to form on the pipe walls, it insulates the remaining water, and the freezing process accelerates. But if water is moving, even at a trickle, it constantly brings warmer water from deeper in the system to the coldest parts of the pipe. More importantly, moving water creates friction, and friction generates a tiny amount of heat. It's not much, maybe a degree or two, but when temperatures are hovering right around the freezing point of 32 degrees Fahrenheit, that tiny difference is everything. There's also the factor of pressure. Water in a pressurized system doesn't freeze at exactly 32 degrees. The pressure raises the freezing point slightly, and moving water helps maintain more consistent pressure throughout the system. When water is allowed to drip, it relieves some of the pressure that would build up if ice blocked the pipes completely, reducing the explosive force that causes ruptures. Tom Brennan, the Kansas farmer who lost his dairy herd in 1943, learned all of this the hardest way possible. He'd installed his water system in 1941, right before America entered World War II. The system included pipes running from his well house to his barn, crossing through an unheated equipment shed along the way. That transition point, where pipes left the relatively warmer well house and entered the unheated space, was the vulnerable zone. During the first cold snap of that winter, Tom's pipes had frozen. He'd done what seemed logical. He shut off the water completely, figuring he'd protect the pipes by keeping them empty. What he didn't realize was that some water always remains in pipes, trapped in low spots and bends. That trapped water froze, creating ice plugs that blocked the system. When he tried to run water again, pressure built up behind those ice dams. Tom spent 3 days trying to thaw his pipes with every method he could think of. He tried pouring hot water over the frozen sections, but the cold air refroze it immediately. He tried wrapping the pipes in burlap soaked with hot water, but it wasn't enough. He even tried using a blowtorch, which was incredibly dangerous and could have blown the whole system apart if he'd heated a pressurized section too quickly. Meanwhile, his cows went without fresh water. Tom tried to compensate by breaking ice in his stock tank outside, but it was a losing battle. The tank froze over faster than he could break it open, and the cows couldn't get enough water. Dairy cows need enormous amounts of water, anywhere from 30 to 50 gallons per day each, depending on their size and milk production. Without adequate water, they stop producing milk within 24 hours. Within 3 days, they can die of dehydration even in the middle of winter. Tom lost all 12 of his dairy cows, animals that represented years of careful breeding and thousands of dollars of investment. In 1943, with wartime restrictions on everything from sugar to steel, replacing those animals was nearly impossible. Tom's farm never recovered. He sold the property in 1946 and moved to Wichita to work in the aircraft factories. But Tom's tragedy became a cautionary tale that spread through farming communities across the Midwest. At grain elevator meetings, church socials, and 4-H gatherings, farmers shared the lesson. Let your faucets drip when the temperature drops below freezing. Let them run a little faster if it's going to be a brutal night. The water you waste will cost you a few cents. The pipes you save will cost hundreds of dollars to replace. The economics made sense even to Depression-era farmers who counted every penny. In the 1940s, municipal water rates in rural areas averaged around 10 cents per 1,000 gallons. Letting a faucet drip at a rate of about 5 drips per minute uses roughly 1 gallon per day. At those rates, running a dripping faucet for an entire month of winter weather cost less than 3 cents. Replacing a section of burst galvanized pipe, including the plumber's labor and the cost of materials, ran anywhere from $50 to $200, depending on the extent of the damage. But there was another factor that made the economics even more compelling: wartime scarcity. From 1942 through 1945, the War Production Board controlled the distribution of steel, copper, and other metals. These materials went to building tanks, ships, and aircraft, not to replacing some farmers' burst water pipes. If your plumbing failed during the war years, you might wait months to get replacement materials, and even then, you'd need special authorization. Robert Chen, whose family ran a vegetable farm in the Salinas Valley of California, experienced this firsthand in the winter of 1944. The Salinas Valley doesn't get Kansas-style cold, but it does get hard freezes, especially in the inland areas. Robert's irrigation system included pipes that ran above ground in some sections, and during an unusual cold snap in February, several sections burst. Robert applied for replacement pipe through the War Production Board's allocation system. He waited 4 months. During that time, he lost an entire planting of early lettuce because he couldn't irrigate properly. The economic hit was severe enough that Robert nearly lost his farm to the bank. When he finally got his replacement pipes, they came with a lecture from the county agricultural agent about proper winter preparation. "You Californians think you don't get cold enough to worry," the agent said. "But anywhere water can freeze, pipes can burst. And in wartime, you can't count on getting replacements." The agent taught Robert the dripping faucet method and another technique that farmers in colder climates had developed: insulation. Not the fancy fiberglass insulation that would become common in later decades, but practical farm insulation made from whatever materials were at hand. Burlap sacks, old newspapers, rags, straw, even manure packed around pipes could provide enough insulation to make the difference between flowing water and burst pipes. The science of insulation is straightforward. Materials with lots of tiny air pockets slow down heat transfer. Air is a poor conductor of heat, so trapping it in the spaces between fibers or particles creates a barrier that keeps cold air from rapidly cooling the water in the pipes. The insulation doesn't prevent heat loss entirely. It just slows it down enough that the water stays above freezing. But insulation alone wasn't reliable enough for the coldest weather. Farmers learned to combine strategies: insulate the vulnerable sections, let faucets drip on cold nights, and most importantly, know your system's weak points. Every plumbing setup had them: pipes running through unheated spaces, sections exposed to north winds, outdoor faucets, pipes running along exterior walls, long runs without use. Martha Kowalski, who raised chickens on a farm outside Minneapolis, developed an almost ritual approach to winter plumbing. Every fall, as soon as the first frost warnings came through on the radio, Martha would walk through her entire property checking every water line. She'd mark the vulnerable spots with red paint. When temperatures dropped into the 20s, she'd set one faucet to a slow drip. When they fell into the teens, she'd increase the flow slightly and start dripping a second faucet at the far end of the system. Below zero, she'd have 3 faucets running, creating enough water movement to keep her entire system flowing. Martha's water bill during a hard winter might run as high as $5 for the whole season. Her neighbors who didn't take the same precautions would often spend $100 or more on emergency plumbing repairs, plus the cost of lost livestock or ruined equipment due to lack of water. The chicken business made Martha particularly aware of the water issue. Chickens need constant access to water, and in winter, that water freezes in their containers within hours unless you're constantly refilling it. Martha had installed heated waterers for her laying hens, but those ran on electricity, and power outages during ice storms were common. Her backup plan was always her plumbing system, assuming the pipes hadn't frozen. She learned the hard way in the winter of 1948, when a surprise cold snap dropped temperatures to 30 below zero overnight. Martha had been complacent. Thinking the worst cold had passed in early February, she hadn't set any faucets to drip. By morning, her pipes were frozen solid, and with electricity also out due to ice-laden power lines, she had no way to provide water to 600 laying hens. Chickens in good health can survive a day or two without water in cold weather, but laying hens are under tremendous physiological stress. They need water to form eggs, to maintain their metabolism, and to survive. Martha lost 63 birds in 2 days before she managed to get her plumbing thawed using a method her father had taught her. Wrapping pipes in rags soaked in hot water heated on her wood stove, then covering those rags with dry towels to hold the heat. It was exhausting, dangerous work. The temperature differential between the hot rags and the frigid metal could cause pipes to crack from thermal stress. The rags had to be changed every few minutes as they lost heat. It took Martha 16 hours of continuous work to thaw enough of her system to get water flowing again. She never forgot the faucet drip after that. Every single winter, even mild ones, Martha started her drip routine at the first forecast of temperatures below 30 degrees. Her neighbors thought she was paranoid. Martha thought she was practical. The practice of letting faucets drip spread through rural America, not through government programs or official recommendations, but through the informal networks that had always governed farm knowledge. Farmers talked at grain elevators, at church, at town meetings. When someone suffered a catastrophic pipe freeze, everyone heard about it. When someone discovered a technique that worked, that knowledge spread just as fast. County extension agents, who served as the agricultural education arm in most rural communities, began incorporating the advice into their winter preparation recommendations by the late 1940s. Extension bulletins on cold weather farming would include sections on protecting plumbing, always mentioning the dripping faucet method, alongside advice about insulation and proper installation techniques. But the most effective teachers were often the oldest farmers, the ones who'd seen enough winters to understand the patterns. They knew which wind directions brought the worst cold. They knew which nights would drop below zero based on cloud cover and humidity. They knew when to drip faucets and when to actually open valves to a thin stream to create enough water movement for truly brutal cold. Old Henry Patterson, who'd farmed the same section of Nebraska prairie since 1908, developed an almost mystical reputation for weather prediction. Other farmers would call him asking whether they needed to drip their faucets that night. Henry would step out onto his porch, look at the sky, test the wind, and give his answer. He was right so often that people started calling him the Farmer's Almanac in person. Henry's secret wasn't mystical at all. He kept detailed records. In small notebooks he'd collected over 4 decades of farming. He'd recorded temperatures, wind directions, precipitation, and the results. He knew that when the wind shifted to the northwest after a clear day and the humidity dropped below 30%, temperatures would plummet overnight. He knew that the coldest part of winter in his region wasn't January, but the first week of February. He knew that still clear nights got colder than cloudy ones because clouds trap heat near the ground. This practical meteorology, combined with an understanding of plumbing vulnerabilities, made Henry a valuable resource to his community. But he was also generous with his knowledge. He'd visit younger farmers in the fall, walk through their properties with them, and point out the places where pipes would freeze. He'd explain why a particular installation was vulnerable and how to protect it. "See this section here," he'd say, pointing to a pipe running along the north wall of a barn. "North wall, no sun or winter. Wind hits it direct. This will freeze first. You insulate this heavy, and you make sure you got a faucet downstream you can drip." Henry's teachings probably saved dozens of farms from the kind of catastrophic losses that had destroyed others. His approach wasn't just about the dripping faucet. It was about understanding the whole system. Where was your water source? How were the pipes routed? What parts were vulnerable? What was your backup plan if something froze anyway? The drilling and installation practices of the time made these questions crucial. Most farm water systems in the mid-20th century were relatively simple. A well, either hand-dug or drilled, connected to an electric or gasoline-powered pump. The pump pushed water into a pressure tank, usually a large steel cylinder that used compressed air to maintain water pressure. From the pressure tank, pipes distributed water to the house, barn, milk house, and other buildings. Each connection point was a potential weak spot. Each transition from heated to unheated space was a vulnerability. Each pipe that ran along an exterior wall or through a crawl space needed protection. The farmers who thought systematically about these issues, who planned their plumbing routes carefully during installation and maintained them diligently through winter, rarely had problems. Those who installed systems haphazardly or who ignored maintenance paid dearly. James Murphy, a dairy farmer in upstate New York, learned to think systematically after his third major pipe freeze in as many winters. Each time, he'd paid for repairs and convinced himself he'd been unlucky. Finally, his plumber sat him down and drew a diagram of his entire water system. "Look at this," the plumber said, tracing the route of James's main water line from the well to the house. "You've got 12 spots where pipes run through unheated crawl spaces or along exterior walls. Every one of them is a place where water can freeze. You can't just fix the breaks and hope for the best. You need to protect the whole system." The plumber helped James redesign parts of his plumbing to avoid the most vulnerable routes. They insulated every section that had to run through unheated spaces. They installed drain valves at low points, so James could empty pipes if necessary. And they identified 3 faucets, strategically placed throughout the system, that James could drip to keep water moving through the entire network. The investment cost James nearly $300, a substantial sum in 1952. But over the next 15 winters, James never had another major pipe freeze. His water bills went up slightly during cold weather when he ran his drip faucets, but those costs were trivial compared to what he'd been spending on emergency repairs. The evolution of farm plumbing through the 1950s and 60s brought new materials and new challenges. Copper pipe began replacing galvanized steel in many installations because copper was easier to work with and less prone to corrosion. But copper had its own freezing vulnerabilities. While copper pipes could handle some expansion from freezing better than steel, they were also thinner-walled and could rupture just as easily under sustained pressure from ice. Plastic pipe, first PVC and later CPVC and PEX, would eventually revolutionize farm plumbing in the late 20th century. These materials had better freeze resistance than metal pipes because they could flex slightly as water froze inside them. But in the 1950s and 60s, plastic pipe was still uncommon, expensive, and not trusted by many rural plumbers and farmers. So the dripping faucet method remained the primary defense against frozen pipes. It was simple, reliable, and required no special materials or skills. Every farmer could do it. Every farm wife knew to check that faucets were dripping before going to bed on cold nights. Every child growing up on a farm learned to listen for the steady plink, plink, plink of water hitting a sink or bucket, a sound that meant safety and security on winter nights. The practice became so ingrained in farm culture that it appeared in small details of rural life. The bucket under the dripping faucet, which had to be emptied every morning. The specific faucets designated as winter drips. The family arguments about whether it was cold enough to start dripping yet. The pride farmers took in making it through a hard winter without a single frozen pipe. There was also the community judgment that came with frozen pipes. A farmer who let his pipes freeze, especially repeatedly, was seen as careless, or ignorant. Farming required constant vigilance, constant attention to hundreds of small details that could mean the difference between success and failure. Protecting your water system was just one of those details, but it was an important one that reflected your overall competence. This social pressure actually helped spread best practices. Young farmers didn't want to be embarrassed at the grain elevator by admitting their pipes had frozen again. Experienced farmers didn't want to lose the respect of their neighbors by showing they couldn't manage basic winter preparation. So knowledge circulated, techniques improved, and gradually, catastrophic pipe freezes became less common in communities where farmers shared information freely. But the practice also revealed class divisions within rural America. Farmers with well-insulated homes, properly installed plumbing, and enough money to afford higher water bills could protect their systems easily. Tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and those working marginal land often struggled with substandard plumbing that froze no matter what they did. In the South, where sharecropping remained common through the 1950s, many farming families dealt with primitive plumbing that was never properly winterized because landlords wouldn't invest in improvements. These families might run faucets all winter and still deal with frozen pipes because the entire system was inadequate. Or they might avoid running water at all to keep bills low, accepting frozen pipes as an inevitable winter hardship. The civil rights movement and the gradual modernization of Southern agriculture in the 1960s brought attention to these inequities. As mechanical cotton pickers replaced hand labor and sharecropping gradually declined, many rural black families moved to towns and cities where adequate plumbing was more common. But the disparities in rural infrastructure remained a point of tension and a reminder that not all farmers had equal access to the kind of reliable water systems that made techniques like dripping faucets effective. For those who did have functional systems, though, the method proved remarkably durable. Even as farming changed dramatically from the 1940s through the 70s, from small diversified farms to larger specialized operations, from hand labor to heavy mechanization, from horses to tractors, the basic practice of letting faucets drip on cold nights remained constant. Modern farmers in the 21st century still do it. The principle hasn't changed. Water still freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice still expands with destructive force. Moving water still resists freezing better than still water, and the economics still favor the tiny cost of wasted water over the substantial cost of replacing burst pipes. But the practice carries with it the accumulated wisdom of generations who learned through hard experience. Tom Brennan and his lost dairy herd, Sarah Mitchell and her ruptured pipes, Martha Kowalski and her dying chickens, Robert Chen and his lost lettuce crop. Every farmer who watched water pour from a split pipe onto a frozen barn floor, every family that spent a hard winter hauling water in buckets because their plumbing had failed. Their experiences, shared and passed down through informal networks of rural knowledge, created a practice that seems simple but represents deep understanding. Understanding of physics and weather, understanding of economics and risk management, understanding of how small preventive actions can avoid catastrophic losses. Understanding that sometimes what looks like waste is actually the most practical kind of conservation. Old Henry Patterson, the Nebraska farmer with his weather notebooks, died in 1968 at the age of 84. His funeral was attended by more than 300 people, farmers who'd known him for decades, and younger farmers who'd learned from him. At the reception afterward, held in the basement of the Lutheran church where Henry had attended services for 6 decades, a young farmer named David Sorensen approached Henry's son. "Your father saved my farm," David said. "First winter I was on my own, 1961. I didn't know anything about protecting pipes. Henry came by, walked me through everything, showed me exactly what to do. I've dripped my faucets every winter since, and I've never had a frozen pipe. That knowledge was worth more than any advice I could have bought." Henry's son nodded. He believed farming was too hard to do alone, he said. He always said the knowledge had to be shared, or the next generation would have to learn everything the hard way all over again. That philosophy of shared knowledge, of community wisdom, passed from experienced to inexperienced, of lessons learned through failure and success, characterized rural American farming culture at its best. The dripping faucet method was just one small example, But it represented something larger, the understanding that survival on the land required more than just individual effort. It required the accumulated experience of everyone who'd faced the same challenges before you. The farms of the mid-20th century are largely gone now, replaced by larger operations, different technologies, different economic realities. But drive through rural America in winter, through small towns in Iowa or Kansas or Wisconsin or Minnesota, and you'll still see it. Water dripping from faucets on cold nights, plink, plink, plink into buckets and sinks. A simple sound carrying the weight of hard-won knowledge. The echo of frozen pipes and lost livestock, and farmers helping each other survive another brutal winter. It's a sound that says, we learned this lesson. We remember what it cost. We're not going to let the cold win again. And in that small act of letting water run, there's a profound statement about human resilience and practical wisdom, about learning from failure, about sharing knowledge, about the unglamorous, everyday actions that make survival possible in a world that doesn't forgive carelessness. The faucet drips, the pipes stay clear, the water flows, and somewhere, a farmer sleeps a little easier, knowing that tomorrow morning, when the cattle need water and the day's work begins, the system will be ready. All because of a lesson learned the hard way, passed down through generations, remembered and practiced faithfully. That's not wasteful. That's survival, that's wisdom, that's the kind of knowledge that built rural America and kept it running through depression and war and brutal winters that tested every family that worked the land. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this story valuable, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share this with others who appreciate the wisdom of America's farming heritage. This video is inspired by real events and historical experiences of American farmers. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individuals or groups. The farmers mentioned in this story are representative characters who reflect the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during the 1930s through 1970s. Their stories remind us of the practical knowledge and community support that sustained rural America through challenging times.